Bikers humiliated Ronda Rousey in a bar and poured beer on her head, unaware of who she was. But everything changed when Chuck Norris walked in. What happened next shocked everyone. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments where you are watching this video from. The night stretched endlessly across the desolate highway, broken only by the occasional flicker of headlights from distant trucks and the fading glow of neon signs promising food, drink, and temporary refuge. Among those lights, one stood out. A bar called The Rusted Hog, perched alone on the edge of nowhere. Its glowing red sign buzzed faintly, one letter half dead, and beneath it, an old gravel lot was littered with motorcycles, their chrome catching the dull shine of the overhead lamps. Inside, the sound of laughter and clinking glasses mixed with the low hum of a jukebox that seemed older than the bar itself. The air was thick with the scent of beer, sweat, and stale cigarette smoke, the kind of place where time felt slow and tempers quick. Ronda Rousey pushed open the door, letting in a brief gust of cool night air that made several heads turn. She stepped inside with quiet confidence, her dark hoodie still damp from the mist outside, her hair pulled back neatly into a ponytail. She wasn't dressed to be noticed, simple jeans, worn sneakers, and the faint tiredness of someone who had spent the evening training. Yet even in her simplicity, there was a presence about her that commanded the kind of attention this bar thrived on. She ignored the stares, scanning the room briefly with the sharpness of someone used to reading every detail in a space before making herself comfortable. She selected a corner table near the wall, where she could see both the entrance and most of the room without needing to shift in her seat. She sat down, the wood of the chair creaking faintly under her weight, and motioned for the bartender. Her order was simple: a bottle of water and something small to eat: eggs, toast, whatever they had. No alcohol. She wasn't here to stay long, and she certainly wasn't here for company. Across the room, however, eyes followed her. A group of men in heavy leather jackets occupied the center of the bar, loud and restless, their laughter cutting sharply through the other conversations. They were unmistakably bikers, thick beards, ink creeping up their necks, rings that glinted when they slammed their hands on the table. Their leader sat in the middle, his broad shoulders straining against his vest, a jagged scar running down his cheek and disappearing into his beard. He watched her with the lazy attention of a predator sizing up prey. At first, their comments were low, private, but one jab led to another, and soon their voices grew louder, deliberately carrying across the bar. One of them tilted his head toward her table, muttering something crude, earning a ripple of laughter. Another tapped the leader's arm and gestured openly toward her. It didn't take long before the tone shifted entirely, mockery bleeding into something uglier, the kind of mean amusement that thrived on testing boundaries. Ronda didn't flinch. Her focus stayed on the simple plate the bartender set before her and the bottle of water beside it. She unscrewed the cap, took a slow sip, and set it down with an unhurried calmness that seemed to irritate the men even more. Her silence was louder than any retort. The leader, who went by Bull, leaned back in his chair with a grin that didn't reach his eyes. His voice boomed over the din of the room as he called out something pointed enough to draw a few laughs from nearby tables. Ronda didn't acknowledge him. Her hands were steady, her gaze fixed on her food, as if he and his crew didn't exist. That, more than any insult, seemed to provoke him. Bull stood with deliberate slowness, his boots echoing on the worn floor as he sauntered toward her table. Conversations quieted slightly. It was clear everyone knew this routine. Bull liked to make examples of people, to remind everyone whose territory this was. The bartender polished a glass nervously, but he didn't move to intervene. Experience told him that getting in the middle of Bull's fun only made things worse. Ronda glanced up briefly, her expression unreadable, then returned to her plate. That was it. No words, no challenge. For Bull, that was as good as an invitation. He stopped beside her table, leaning an arm on the back of the chair opposite her. His presence loomed heavy, his bulk casting a shadow across her plate. "Aren't you going to say hello?" he drawled in a voice thick with mockery. The other bikers chuckled from their seats, watching closely. Ronda calmly lifted another bite of her food to her mouth, chewed, and set her fork down. She didn't answer. Bull's grin widened. He straightened and glanced back at his crew, who were now fully engaged, their eyes alight with the cruel anticipation of a performance. One of them shouted something encouraging, urging him on. The silence that followed was suffocating. The air in the bar seemed to thicken as Bull reached for the nearest beer from a passing server's tray. He took a long sip, never breaking his gaze from Ronda, then let out a low laugh that was meant for her, but directed at everyone else. By then, all eyes were on her table. The jukebox hummed faintly in the background, its notes oddly hollow against the tension building in the room. Even those who had no stake in the situation, lonely truckers at the bar, locals nursing their third drink, leaned in slightly, unable to look away. This was entertainment in the Rusted Hog, a test of dominance, a ritual everyone had seen before, but never with someone who looked like her. Ronda adjusted in her seat slightly, not in fear but in deliberate, measured composure. She reached for her water, uncapped it, and drank again, unhurried, as though the towering man before her was nothing more than background noise. That, more than anything, lit a spark behind Bull's eyes. He turned, glanced at his men, then back at her, and the smirk that formed told the whole bar that this wasn't over, not by a long shot. And somewhere in the thick, heavy quiet that followed, as Bull's laughter rose again and his boots scraped closer across the floor, it became clear. Tonight, the Rusted Hog was about to see something it had never seen before. Bull stood over Ronda's table like a mountain casting its shadow. His heavy boots planted firmly on the stained floorboards, his arms crossed casually over his broad chest. He stared down at her with the smugness of someone who had rehearsed this scene many times. The bar had fallen into a hush that wasn't quite silence, but something close. The jukebox crooned faintly from the corner. Glasses clinked distantly at the bar. Yet all attention was funneled toward this single point. Ronda sat unmoving, her posture relaxed but sharp, her hands resting neatly beside her plate, as though none of this concerned her. Bull smirked and tilted his head, scanning her with the dismissive air of a man who saw only an opportunity to put on a show for his friends. His crew was watching him closely now, their crude smiles full of expectation. One of them called out something from the back, words drowned in drunken laughter, and Bull chuckled lowly, as if feeding off their attention. He grabbed a nearby chair, spun it around, and straddled it backward right beside her table. The wood groaned under his weight as he leaned forward, elbows on the backrest, invading her space. "You hear me talking to you?" He muttered, his tone carrying that edge of mock challenge that was less about conversation and more about performance. Ronda didn't answer. She continued cutting into her meal with deliberate care, her knife gliding smoothly across the plate. She speared another bite, brought it to her mouth, and ate as though he weren't even there. Her face was calm, impassive. A ripple went through the bar. That silence. It wasn't submission. It wasn't fear either. It was something else entirely, and it unsettled even those who didn't want to admit it. Bull shifted slightly in his seat, though his grin never faltered. His pride wouldn't allow it. He leaned closer, his breath heavy with beer, his voice dropping low enough for those nearest to lean in and catch every word. "You come in here dressed like that, sitting all by yourself, not talking to anyone. What, you think you're too good to speak?" His words hung in the air, oily and sharp, drawing a few snickers from his men. Ronda finished chewing, set her fork down, and reached for her bottle of water. She twisted the cap off smoothly, took a slow drink, and returned it to the table. Not once did she look at him. Bull's grin twitched. He glanced back at his table, saw the eager faces of his crew egging him on, and knew he couldn't back down. His pride demanded escalation. He rose from the chair, standing tall now, and grabbed the nearest half-full glass of beer from a passing tray. The server stiffened, clearly unwilling but unwilling to intervene, and stepped back quickly as Bull rolled the cool glass between his fingers. "You know what happens to people who ignore me?" he said, his voice loud enough to cut across the bar. His men cheered him on, laughing. Without warning, Bull tilted the glass and let its contents splash deliberately across Ronda's table. The golden liquid spread fast, soaking the wood and spilling over the edge, dripping down onto her jeans and the floor beneath. A loud cheer erupted from the biker table. Ronda didn't move. She calmly reached for a napkin, folded it neatly, and began dabbing at the edge of the spill, her motions slow and measured. Not a single muscle in her face changed. No anger, no surprise, nothing. Bull froze for a brief second, taken aback by her composure, but the jeers from behind him pushed him onward. He sneered, stepping closer, towering over her now. He wanted to see fear, a flinch, anything to break that unnerving stillness. When none came, his smirk warped into something crueler. He tilted his head back and downed the rest of his beer in one long swallow. Foam clung to his beard as he slammed the empty glass on the table, making the plates rattle. Then he picked up another full pint from a nearby tray and, with exaggerated slowness, held it over her head. The bar seemed to hold its breath. With a tilt of his wrist, the beer poured out in a frothy cascade, drenching Ronda completely. It soaked her hoodie, ran down her hair, and dripped from her chin in rivulets onto the floor. A chorus of laughter erupted around them, crude and sharp, echoing through the bar like a drumbeat. Ronda's hands moved once, slowly brushing wet strands of hair back from her face. She reached for another napkin from the holder, wiped her forehead, and let it fall on the table. She looked up then, meeting Bull's eyes, not with anger, not with fear, but with a steady, measured calmness that cut deeper than any retaliation ever could. The laughter faltered, only slightly but enough to be felt. Bull's grin faltered too, though he quickly masked it with forced bravado. He stepped back a pace, glancing at his men. "Look at her," he barked, his voice strained now in its attempt to keep control of the room. "Won't even lift a hand. Guess she knows her place." His men laughed on cue, but it rang thinner now, forced. Ronda picked up her bottle of water and drank deeply. Then without a word, she set it down and adjusted her seat, still soaked but entirely unfazed. The very lack of reaction became its own kind of weapon, a silent defiance that unsettled even those who didn't fully understand why. The bartender's hands paused mid-motion as he polished another glass. He was watching now, too, his brow furrowed. He'd seen countless fights start here. Shattered bottles, overturned tables, blood smeared across knuckles, but he'd never seen anything quite like this. The tension was no longer just drunken aggression. It was sharper now, like something had shifted in the air, and no one could name it. Bull's face darkened. He'd come this far, and still nothing. Not even a raised voice. That calm, that absolute refusal to give him what he wanted, it was infuriating. He gestured sharply at his men, and two of them stood, moving closer. The bar's energy thickened with anticipation. Chairs scraped back against the floor. A few patrons slipped toward the door, sensing where this was headed. And yet, through it all, Ronda sat there, drenched and still as stone, her gaze level, her posture unbroken. Bull loomed closer, his shadow stretching over her again, his voice dropping low. "You're not laughing now, are you?" Ronda blinked once, slowly. Then she reached for another napkin and wiped the last streak of beer from her cheek. Her silence was absolute, unshakable. For a long moment, even Bull seemed unsure what to do next. And then the door to the bar creaked open behind him. The sudden gust of cold night air swept through the room, scattering the heavy scent of beer and sweat. Heads turned instinctively, conversations dying mid-sentence. In the doorway, framed by the neon glow from outside, stood a figure who carried himself with the kind of weight that shifted an entire room without a single word. Bull didn't turn immediately, but the sudden hush that fell told him something was different. Something had changed, and when he finally did glance over his shoulder, the look that flickered across his face was a mix of confusion and something he hadn't felt in years: doubt. The man who had just entered was no ordinary passerby. His steady stride, his broad frame beneath a faded denim shirt, and the calm, piercing gaze that swept the room with quiet authority, all of it demanded attention. The patrons recognized it instantly, even if they couldn't name it, and deep down, so did Bull. The night at the Rusted Hog was far from over. The door hadn't even closed behind him, and yet the room already felt different. A chill trailed in from the night outside, curling around the legs of chairs, creeping under the tables like a warning. Conversations that had paused didn't resume. No one moved, no one sipped their drinks. The usual symphony of clinking glasses and murmured banter fell into a stunned silence. Every eye turned, some slowly, others with instinctive caution, toward the figure standing just inside the doorway, framed in cold air and the flickering glow of the dying neon. Chuck Norris didn't rush. He never did. His boots landed solidly on the old wood floor, heel first, measured and deliberate. 1, 2, 3 steps in, and already the energy of the bar was in retreat. He didn't wear anything flashy. A sun-faded denim shirt, sleeves casually rolled to the forearms, well-worn jeans that had seen better days, and boots scuffed from long miles walked. There was no need for bravado. His presence alone was a punctuation mark in a place built on exclamation. He didn't scan the room so much as acknowledge it. A single glance, slow and meaningful, that passed over the crowd like a tide, washing away their earlier laughter, their smug cruelty, their illusion of control. The bikers who had moments ago shouted insults and reveled in spilled beer now sat a little stiffer in their seats. A couple shifted uncomfortably. Even those who didn't immediately recognize him sensed something, they couldn't name it, but their instincts whispered that something in the room had just become heavier. Real. Bull turned, his posture visibly tense for the first time that evening. He squinted, trying to place the man's face. The scar on his cheek twitched slightly. His crew behind him had gone quiet, and that silence added to his unease. Something about this stranger wasn't right. Not wrong, not threatening in the obvious way, but undeniably different. Chuck's gaze came to rest on Rhonda. She was still seated, soaked in beer, her arms relaxed at her sides, but now her eyes lifted. The briefest flicker of recognition passed between them, subtle, almost imperceptible. He gave her a small nod, just once, and that was enough. She didn't move. She didn't need to. The shift had already begun. Chuck stepped farther into the room. He didn't look at Bull, not yet. His eyes moved to the bar, where the bartender froze mid-polish, his knuckles white around a damp rag. Then toward the back wall, where regulars who had seen too many ugly nights here sat straight in their booths, waiting. Only then did Chuck turn his head slowly and fix his eyes on the man who had poured beer over Rhonda's head. The moment their eyes met, the truth arrived like thunder. Bull blinked, and for a second his face betrayed him. He recognized the man now, not just from television, not from memes or stories, but from something older, a legend that lived behind headlines and movie posters. A man whose real strength came not from the roles he played, but from the silence he carried. Chuck didn't speak immediately. He didn't have to. He closed the distance between them with quiet finality, the air itself seeming to tense with every step. And when he finally stopped, just a few feet from Bull, it was not with aggression, but stillness. Calm, like a lake before a storm. Bull straightened, puffing up instinctively, though the move lacked conviction. His grin returned, forced this time, stretched too wide across his face. "What's this?" he said with a rasp in his voice, gesturing broadly. "You here to save the lady? You another friend of hers?" Chuck finally spoke, and his voice was low, steady, and clear. "I came here because someone crossed a line." The words were simple, but they hit the room with the weight of final judgment. Bull's mouth twitched, but he didn't respond immediately. Behind him, the laughter had long since died. One of his crew reached up to scratch his neck, but stopped halfway. Another stared into his beer, as if hoping to disappear into the foam. Chuck's eyes scanned the table, the crowd, the floor where the puddles of beer still glistened in the flickering light. Then his gaze returned to Bull. "And from where I'm standing," he said, "you've got one chance to make it right." The threat wasn't in the words. It was in the absence of any threat at all. Chuck didn't raise his voice. He didn't square his shoulders or raise a fist. He simply stood there, immovable, patient, and undeniably ready. Bull forced a scoff, tried to laugh, but it caught in his throat. "You think you can just walk in here and—" Chuck took one more step forward. It was slight, barely an inch, but it turned the temperature of the room colder than ice. Bull stopped talking. The silence stretched, brittle and taut. Then, desperately clinging to his unraveling dominance, Bull reached for a bar stool and tossed it aside with a crash. "You don't scare me," he spat, his voice hoarse. "This ain't your show." Chuck tilted his head slightly, as if considering that. Then, without warning, he moved. No wind-up, no hesitation. One sharp pivot, one smooth arc of motion, and his right leg snapped up and around. The roundhouse kick connected cleanly with Bull's chest, not too high, not showy, but delivered with the force of years of disciplined technique. The impact echoed through the bar. Bull's body flew backward, his feet lifting clean off the floor as he crashed over the table behind him. Bottles shattered. A chair cracked beneath him. He hit the ground with a thud that rattled through the room, and then stillness. Chuck lowered his leg and adjusted his footing. No celebration, no breathless aftermath. He merely turned and looked at the others. The bikers didn't move. Not one. No retaliation. No bravado. Their eyes were wide, their expressions frozen between disbelief and awe. The bartender dropped the rag. Somewhere near the door, a man whispered, "Was that really him?" Chuck turned back toward Ronda. She had risen now, quietly, as if the moment required reverence. Her hair still clung to her damp hoodie, but she looked composed, steady, unbroken. She didn't speak, but when Chuck met her eyes, he saw the spark of shared understanding there. Respect, not for what he had done, but for why. Chuck gave a short nod, then turned his gaze back toward the stunned crowd. His voice was softer now, but still carried through every inch of the room. "You picked the wrong person to humiliate tonight," he said, "and you're lucky it was her, because she chose patience." He looked toward Bull, who was groaning on the floor, struggling to rise. "I don't always show up for messes that aren't mine," Chuck said, his eyes sweeping the room. "But when someone like Ronda Rousey gets spit on by cowards trying to feel like men, that's not just her fight. That's every decent person's fight." A murmur ran through the bar. No one looked at Chuck directly now. Their eyes darted down or away. It wasn't fear. Not exactly. It was something deeper. Guilt, shame, a slowly sinking awareness that they had watched something monstrous unfold and done nothing to stop it. Chuck looked back at Ronda. "Ready?" She nodded once. The silence between them was more solid than words. They began to walk together side by side through the stunned bar, past the overturned chair, the shattered glass, the puddles of beer still reflecting the trembling neon light. No one moved to stop them. No one dared. The door creaked open again, this time not with wind, but with reverence. And when it closed behind them, it wasn't just the cold night air that crept back into the rusted hog. It was something else, something heavier. The sense that everything inside had changed, forever. The cold wind howled through the parking lot like a reprimand from nature itself, rattling the old bar sign and whistling through the rows of motorcycles lined like teeth in front of the rusted hog. Inside, the atmosphere was still paralyzed by the echo of the roundhouse kick that had launched Bull across the bar. The room hadn't breathed since Chuck Norris and Ronda Rousey walked out the door. Eyes were fixed on the spot where he had stood, on the chair he had moved around, on the shards of glass still glinting on the floor beneath the table. Then, as if time itself had been held back, it slowly crept forward. Someone shifted in a seat. A bottle was quietly set down. The jukebox, which had stopped mid-track during the moment of impact, buzzed faintly, trying to resume the song that no longer suited the mood. The bartender still stood behind the counter, hands planted on the bar, staring at the entrance. For a moment he looked like he might speak, but said nothing. On the floor, Bull stirred, coughing as he tried to lift himself onto his elbows. His face was pale with the shock of what had happened, his chest heaving from the impact that had knocked the air clean out of his lungs. The bravado, the swagger, the crude humor, all of it had been shattered in that single moment. His hand trembled as he grabbed the edge of a table, pulling himself into a sitting position. His crew looked at him, but not one of them moved to help. They had seen their leader fly backward like a rag doll, tossed by a man who hadn't even flinched. And more than that, they had watched Ronda take every insult, every humiliation, and remain composed. They had laughed, barked, challenged, while she had endured, steady as stone. And now they saw what they hadn't wanted to. Her restraint was not weakness. It was power, the kind they didn't understand, the kind that didn't scream for attention or demand submission. Tank, the second largest of the group, sat stiffly, rubbing the back of his neck, eyes locked on the broken table. A man known for throwing punches just to make a point now said nothing. The others nursed their drinks with downcast eyes. No one dared to mention Chuck's name. It hung in the air like a fog, unspoken but present. At the far end of the bar, a thin man with a snake tattoo curling up his neck finally broke the silence with a whisper. Was that really Chuck Norris? The bartender exhaled long and slow, finally moving again. He picked up a clean glass that didn't need cleaning and wiped it anyway. Yeah, he muttered. And the woman? That was Ronda Rousey. A low sound moved through the room. Not a cheer, not a sigh, but the hushed, humbled realization of something that should have been obvious. The quiet ones, the calm ones, the ones who never raised their voices. Bull staggered to his feet. His legs were shaky, his pride even shakier. He looked around and saw not admiration or concern, but pity. The eyes of the room didn't fear him anymore. Worse than that, they didn't respect him. He opened his mouth to speak, to reclaim something, anything, but no words came. Only a shallow breath and the sound of boots on the floor. Someone cleared his throat near the bar. Another man stood slowly, almost apologetically, and made his way toward the exit, not looking at anyone as he left. A waitress who had stood still through the entire ordeal stepped forward now, approached the bartender, and leaned in. You think they'll come back? She asked in a voice barely above a whisper. The bartender set the glass down and looked at the empty table in the corner where Rhonda had been sitting just minutes before. The surface still bore the stains of spilled beer, the crumpled napkins, the untouched plate of food. He shook his head slightly. I don't know, he said honestly, but if they do, someone better make damn sure they're treated right. And with that, the weight of the moment settled deeper. Every patron in that bar knew the truth now. They had watched something unfold that went far beyond fists or insults. It had been a test of character, and most of them had failed it. But outside, under the glow of a flickering street lamp, Chuck and Rhonda walked side by side across the gravel. Their steps were quiet, unhurried, as if they had just left a dinner party instead of a confrontation. The night air wrapped around them, cool and clear, a stark contrast to the heat of the bar they had left behind. Chuck's pickup truck stood beneath the old lamp, casting long shadows. They stopped beside it, neither speaking at first. The silence between them wasn't awkward, it was earned. The kind of silence that follows understanding. You didn't need me in there, Chuck said finally, his voice low and warm. Rhonda glanced sideways, her expression calm but carrying a hint of a smile. Maybe not, she replied, but they did. Chuck chuckled softly, nodding. That's true. They stood for a moment longer, both looking back toward the bar, where the neon light now seemed less aggressive, almost regretful. Inside, the same laughter that had filled the space before was gone, replaced by reflection. You never even raised a hand, Chuck said, as if admiring it aloud. You took everything they threw at you and stayed still. That's not easy. Rhonda looked away toward the dark highway beyond. I've thrown enough punches, she said. Sometimes people need to see what it looks like when you don't. Chuck nodded slowly, approvingly. I've always said the strongest person in the room is usually the one who doesn't need to prove it. Rhonda smirked faintly. And yet you kicked that guy halfway across the bar. Chuck raised an eyebrow, his face turning playful. Hey, I never said I was the strongest person in the room. They both laughed. It was a rare, genuine moment. No performance, no posture. Just two warriors who had spent lifetimes mastering strength, not just the kind that breaks bones, but the kind that holds back when it matters most. As the sound of their laughter faded into the night, Chuck placed a hand on Rhonda's shoulder. They'll remember tonight. Rhonda's face turned thoughtful. Let's hope they remember the right part. He opened the door to the truck, and they both climbed in. The engine rumbled to life, its sound deeper than the wind that swept across the lot. The headlights flashed on, cutting through the darkness. As they pulled away, dust kicked up behind the tires, and the bar grew smaller in the rearview mirror. But even as it faded into the distance, the impact of what had happened there remained. Inside, the empty chair by the window stood untouched. The shattered glass remained on the floor. The spilled beer had dried into stains that no one would clean up just yet, because that night, the rusted hog had witnessed something it couldn't laugh off. A woman had walked in alone, faced cruelty, and remained unbroken. A man had stepped in, not to steal the spotlight, but to remind everyone watching that decency still existed, and together, without fanfare or revenge, they had walked out, not as victims, not even as heroes, but as living proof that real strength needs no applause, only dignity, and the kind of silence that echoes long after the storm is gone. Inside the rusted hog, the quiet lingered like a fog that refused to lift. The jukebox remained frozen mid-song, its dim display still flickering faintly, but no one moved to restart it. The air smelled of stale beer and tension, heavy with the weight of what had just unfolded. The bikers who, not long ago, had been laughing and jeering, now sat hunched over, their bravado stripped away. The once booming laughter had evaporated into an uneasy stillness. The sound of Bull's groaning as he sat slumped against the wreckage of a broken table was the only thing punctuating the silence. His scarred face was twisted, not just in pain, but humiliation, as though he himself couldn't quite comprehend how quickly he had been dismantled, physically and otherwise. The bartender exhaled slowly and finally dared to move, setting down the rag he had been wringing in his hand since the fight. He looked at the bikers, then at Bull, and for the first time in years he felt no fear of them. They were no longer the predators of the room. The balance of power had shifted in a way that everyone could feel, but no one wanted to say aloud. Behind the counter, he poured himself a small glass of whiskey with steady hands, tipped it back, and let it burn down his throat. He had watched countless fights here, broken noses, bloody knuckles, cheap threats that usually ended in someone being dragged out by their buddies. But what he had just seen was different. It hadn't even been a fight. It had been an execution of control. The kind of control that didn't roar or snarl. It simply was. Tank, one of Bull's lieutenants, shifted in his seat, his massive arms resting on the table, but his eyes stayed glued to the floor. His fingers tapped nervously against the wood in an uneven rhythm, as if he was trying to find something familiar, some anchor to remind him that this was just another night at the bar. But it wasn't. He felt it in the pit of his stomach. They all did. Snake, the wiry one with the tattoo on his neck, broke the silence first. His voice was soft, uncertain, almost reluctant. "That was Chuck Norris," he said, as if speaking it aloud might confirm it for himself. The words hung in the air, absorbed by the stillness. Someone near the bar muttered a curse under his breath, a quiet acknowledgement of what they had all witnessed but hadn't dared admit until now. "And the woman," the bartender added grimly, "was Ronda Rousey." Heads turned toward the table she had occupied. It still sat there in the corner, untouched since they left. Her unfinished meal was cold, congealed. The puddle of beer that Bull had poured over her head had dripped onto the floor and pooled beneath the chair, a physical reminder of just how far their cruelty had gone. And yet she had never retaliated. She had endured their mockery, their insults, the sticky beer soaking through her clothes, and she hadn't raised her voice once. Tank rubbed his jaw slowly, his voice breaking the silence again. She didn't even blink. The bartender leaned on the counter, staring at that empty table. "And that's why he came," he said finally. "Because she didn't have to fight back. She didn't need to." Bull groaned again, trying to stand, but when his knees wobbled, he collapsed back onto the floor. No one rushed to help him. His own crew wouldn't meet his eyes. They'd seen him dominate this bar countless times, shoving drunks, knocking out anyone who dared speak up. But now they saw him sprawled in defeat, not just by Chuck's kick, but by the quiet judgment of the room. The waitress, who had been silent all night, moved cautiously from behind the counter, collecting glasses from nearby tables. Her voice trembled slightly as she spoke, directed at no one in particular. "You think they'll come back?" The bartender didn't look away from that corner table. His thumb rubbed idly at a small chip in the wood of the bar, as if he could focus the weight of the night into that one spot. "If they do," he said slowly, then someone better make sure their drinks are ready the second they sit down, and nobody says a damn word until they do. A nervous laugh slipped out from one of the regulars in the back. Not mocking, but uneasy. It wasn't disagreement. It was the laugh of someone who had just realized how close they had come to being on the wrong side of something they couldn't have controlled if they tried. Snake stared at Bull, who now sat against the wall, holding his ribs and breathing hard. His voice was low, laced with something that almost sounded like pity. "We all thought she was just some girl passing through," he murmured. "We thought she was nothing." He shook his head slowly, almost in disbelief. And she sat there the whole time like she was just waiting, like she knew. The bartender cleared his throat, his gaze sharp now. She did know. You could see it in her eyes. She wasn't scared. She was letting you dig your own grave. Bull's lip curled faintly, but even he didn't argue. What was there to say? He'd been humiliated in front of everyone, not just by Chuck's kick, but by the way Ronda had looked at him without fear. That look, calm, steady, and unflinching, had cut deeper than the impact that had sent him crashing over a table. Outside, Chuck's truck was already gone, its taillights fading into the black ribbon of highway. Ronda was beside him, her head turned slightly toward the window, watching the neon glow of the rusted hog vanish behind them. Neither spoke for several miles. The hum of the engine filled the cab, steady and even, as though it understood the weight of silence between them. Finally, Chuck broke it. "They'll remember tonight," he said, his hands loose on the steering wheel. His tone wasn't boastful, it was matter-of-fact, a simple observation. Rhonda's gaze stayed fixed on the darkness beyond her window. "Good," she said softly. "Maybe it'll change them." Chuck chuckled quietly. "Maybe. Or maybe it'll just remind them who they can't push around anymore." Rhonda smirked faintly, a rare crack in her calm. "They thought I was weak because I stayed quiet. They thought it meant I couldn't do anything." Chuck glanced at her, his expression thoughtful. Silence scares people like that, because it doesn't give them what they want. They feed on reactions. You didn't give them one. Rhonda leaned back in her seat, her eyes half closed. "And you gave them exactly what they deserved." Chuck laughed lowly. "Sometimes restraint teaches better than a kick. But sometime," he added with a faint grin, "a kick drives the point home." The two of them shared a quiet laugh, warm and subdued, the kind that fades naturally rather than ends abruptly. The truck rolled on through the empty highway, headlights cutting a clear path through the dark. Behind them, the rusted hog remained frozen in its own uneasy stillness, a place changed not by a fight, but by a lesson. Inside the bar, patrons continued to sit silently, each lost in their own thoughts. Nobody dared pick up the jukebox remote. Nobody wanted to break the spell of what had happened. Bull sat with his head down, his breath slow and shallow, while his crew stared at their drinks like they might find answers in the amber depths. For years, the rusted hog had been a place of noise of dominance shouted loudly and fists slammed harder than words. But that night, it learned something that none of them would forget. Real strength didn't roar. It didn't brawl for attention. It didn't need to pound its chest. Real strength walked in quietly, stood its ground without fanfare, and left behind a silence so heavy it rang louder than any fight ever could. And as the last of the patrons filtered out into the night, leaving Bull and his broken pride behind, the bartender flipped the sign on the door to closed. He looked once more at the empty corner table, at the abandoned meal, and at the lingering shadow of the two legends who had sat there. He muttered softly to himself, a quiet phrase almost lost to the hum of the neon sign outside. "They'll remember." And in that stillness, everyone knew he was right. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next story. Watch our other videos for more like this, and share this video with others if you found it worth watching.